Hello everyone, Professor Kruzluk here. So for today's video, I wanted to talk about the first few chapters of Larry Bartels Unequal Democracy. So we know we've been looking at elections, electoral politics from a few different perspectives. And Bartel takes a uh, pretty critical view of economic and power disparities in the American electoral and American political system. So as we start to think about it, and we've been talking about it, and you'll hear me talk about it more here, we don't necessarily have to agree with Bartel. Maybe you disagree with Bartel. Really, we're just trying to put our pieces that we've had this semester together, different perspectives on what shapes the average voter, what shapes American politics, what shapes elections. And in Bartel's book, I'll talk here about the first three chapters. It lays out the main parts of their argument. So these chapters do tackle some of the biggest questions in electoral politics that we've covered week after week. And he's looking at how does inequality develop in a democracy, in a system like the U.S. He looks at do presidents and parties really matter for economic outcomes, or is it just market forces beyond the capacity and the capabilities of electoral politics? And if so, if presidents and parties matter, do voters hold them accountable in ways that Bartel argues strengthen democracies, or in ways that unintentionally reinforce inequality? So the past several of our readings have really looked at this connection between economic factors and electoral politics, and Bartel fits right into that theme while looking at the topic, the subject, from slightly different perspectives, because we're starting to see our different authors, of course, addressing these similar issues just from different perspectives. And as political scientists, that's what we're trying to think about. How do different authors try to make sense of the world, try to make sense of the American political system? So Bartel begins with a reminder, or an argument at least, that inequality in the United States has increased dramatically in recent decades. He argues that since the 1970s, income gains have been more and more concentrated at the top. He argues the top 1% of Americans today hold more than 20% of income, and the top 0.1% alone, just 1 in 1,000 households, control over 1/5 of the nation's wealth. By comparison, the bottom half of Americans own just a sliver of the pie. So we hear, even if we're not all political scientists and we don't love following the news, we hear these discussions about wealth inequality, about income inequality, about concentration of wealth. So Bartel is trying to bring this into the realm of elections, and that's why it fits well into our class. So Bartel argues that this sharp rise in inequality has been described as the new Gilded Age, evoking the late 19th century era when industrial tycoons like Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie amassed vast fortunes, while ordinary workers struggled. They sold their labor for low incomes. So Bartel argues that this inequality that we know is just built into a capitalist economic system. We know that any system has inequalities. Even a quotation communist country like China still has inequalities. So inequality is just a nature of a market system. However, Bartel argues that inequality is not just an economic story, it's also a political story. And to make that case, Bartel draws on three interconnected themes: the historical rise of inequality, the partisan political economy, and the biases in electoral accountability that shape how voters respond. So, to frame this issue, Bartel brings us back to a classic question from political science: Robert Dahl's Who Governs? In the 1950s, Dahl studied politics in New Haven, Connecticut, and concluded that power was fairly dispersed across different groups. No single elite dominated. Business leaders had influence in some areas, but labor unions, civic groups, and ordinary citizens all had access to the political process and access to the levers of power. For Dahl, who comes up in all of our readings in basically anything that looks at democracy, Robert Dahl makes an appearance. And for Dahl, this was evidence of pluralism, a system where multiple interests competed and where democracy functioned reasonably well in the presence of inequality. Bartel takes a different approach. And again, Dahl, we think about a lot in political science. He makes an appearance in many of our readings, if not all of them, even in Political Science 100, like an introductory course. Robert Dahl's work is influential. Bartel takes a slightly different approach. Bartel suggests that Dahl's optimism doesn't hold up in today's America. He argues the distribution of resources has shifted dramatically since the mid-20th century. Campaigns are vastly more expensive. Lobbying is dominated by well-funded corporate interests, and labor unions, once a counterweight to business power, have seen their membership fall from 1/3 of the workforce in the 1950s to less than 11, around 10% today. So when we revisit Dahl's question, who actually governs, the answer is far less comforting if we subscribe to Larry Bartel's views. He argues that wealth and power influence are now concentrated in ways that challenge the democratic ideal of equal citizenship. So, one common explanation for inequality is that it's simply the result of global markets and technological change. So politicians, journalists, and even economists often say that forces like globalization, which we'll see in some of our other readings, automation, and the rise of information technology naturally creates winners and losers. For example, Bartel brings up in 2006, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson claimed inequality was simply an economic reality, not something politics could do much about. Media commentary at the time echoed that view, describing inequality as an unavoidable side effect of modern capitalism. Bartel, though, challenges this idea. He argues that inequality is not simply the product of impersonal economic forces. It is deeply shaped by political choices. And he provides evidence that he substantiates his argument with evidence that partisan control of the presidency has had a sizable impact on economic growth across different groups of Americans. So when he talks about this partisan political economic divide, what evidence does he show? So Bartel brings as receipts as evidence for his argument that he uses Census Bureau data from 1948 through the early 2000s, where he compares economic growth under Democratic and Republican presidents. He argues that the results are pretty striking. He brings to the table poor families' incomes. He says grew about 10 times faster under Democratic presidents than Republicans. When he looks at middle class incomes, he said they grew more than twice as fast under Democrats. But then when he looks at affluent families, those near the top of the economic distribution, they did quite well under both parties. But their growth under Republicans was stronger. So the net effect is clear that Bartel argues that inequality tended to narrow under Democratic presidents and widen under Republicans. So Bartel argues that these findings are not limited to one or two unusual cases. He tests whether partisan differences could be accidents of history. Perhaps Democrats got lucky when they were in power and they just happened to have post-war booms, while Republicans got unlucky and they were stuck with oil shocks or recessions. Bartel argues that in his models and his research models, that he controls for these factors. And still, Bartel argues that these partisan gaps persist. He argues that it is systematic, not accidental. So, to illustrate this, he considers two eras. Under Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, policies like the Great Society and the War on Poverty were accompanied by economic growth across the board. Under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, tax cuts tilted heavily towards the wealthy and economic growth. Disproportionately, then, benefited those at the top. Bartel argues that these are not isolated examples. Instead, he argues that they reflect broader partisan priorities that have been consistent for decades. So another layer to this story involves the timing of economic performance. Economists like Alberto Alessandria have argued that parties manage the economy differently across presidential terms. Bartel extends this logic. He argues that Democrats often stimulate growth early in their terms, prioritizing employment and income gains. Conversely, he argues that Republicans frequently pursue restraint early on, tightening budgets or raising interest rates, and then engineering a recovery later on, often just before elections, he argues. So he uses the example of Richard Nixon's new economic policy in 1971-1972, which included wage and price controls, followed by stimulus before his landslide re-election. Or he considers Ronald Reagan, who presided over a deep recession in 1981 and 82, but then enjoyed a booming recovery by 1984, just in time for his Morning in America campaign. So Bartel argues that this pattern shows how presidents can shape not just the long-term distribution of growth, but also its short-term timing. So then what specific choices drive these differences? Bartel points to several areas. First is fiscal policy. He argues that Democrats have tended to use government spending and tax policy to support broad growth. Republicans, he argues, emphasized tax cuts, often tilted towards higher incomes. When it comes to monetary policy, he argues that Democrats generally prioritize employment even at the risk of higher inflation. Republicans, conversely, emphasize inflation control even at the cost of higher unemployment, and looks at social programs. That Democratic administrations have expanded programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, whereas Republican administrations have pushed for cuts or slower growth in these areas. So Bartels says, taken together, these differences explain much of the partisan gap in income growth. So the overall economic record, Bartels says, is true. He is arguing that different administrations lead to these policies. So he points out unemployment has been nearly 1 percentage point lower on average under Democratic presidents. He argues that GDP growth has been more than 1 percentage point higher under Democrats. And when he looks at inflation, he says it's been roughly the same under both parties, undermining the argument that Republicans make, that Republicans are better at controlling prices. So Bartels' argument here is that not only do Democrats produce faster income growth for most Americans, but the broader economy has also generally performed better under their leadership. So he's laying out what his argument. He's saying that one party controls the economy better. So at this point then, Bartel claims that you might expect voters would consistently reward Democrats at the ballot box. After all, if ordinary families do better under Democratic presidents, shouldn't that translate into electoral dominance and electoral victories? But here's where Chapter 3 comes in Bartels' work. Bartels shows that voters often fail to hold leaders accountable in ways that align with long-term economic interests. He identifies 3 major biases that voters have. First, he calls it myopia. That voters focus on the election year economy rather than the full presidential term. If conditions improve just before an election, incumbents benefit, even if earlier years had weak economic growth. This allows presidents to, what he calls, quote, game this system with short-term boosts. Next, he argues that there is a sensitivity to affluent incomes. Voters of all income levels, he argues, tend to respond more strongly to growth among the wealthy than the growth among the poor or middle class. In other words, when the rich do well, voters often perceive the economy as doing well, even if inequality is widening. So Bartel also points to the third thing, which he calls campaign finance advantages. So Republicans benefiting from affluent donors often outspend Democrats. Greater resources for advertising and mobilization help offset weaker overall economic records. So together, these biases help explain how Republicans have often won elections despite overseeing slower economic growth for most of the citizens. So Bartel argues that the broader implications are sobering. Elections do matter a great deal for inequality, he argues. Partisan control over the presidency has had profound consequences for the distribution of incomes in the United States. But electoral accountability doesn't always function the way democratic theory suggests. Instead of rewarding parties that improve broad economic well-being, voters often respond to short-term conditions, to perceptions shaped by affluent outcomes, or to campaign spending advantages. So in this sense, democracy has not reliably corrected inequality. In fact, Bartel argues electoral dynamics have sometimes reinforced inequality. So let's close out since we're almost at the 20-minute mark. So, looking at the first 3 chapters of Bartel's writing, where does that leave us? Bartel brings to the forefront evidence that suggests 3 big takeaways. 1, inequality in the United States is not inevitable, or at least to the extent that it is. Maybe in any economic system, you'll have some inequality, but maybe not to the level that it is. Instead, Bartel argues that it is shaped and reinforced by political choices. Those choices differ systematically by party, meaning presidential elections have real material consequences for ordinary Americans. And third, voters do not always recognize or reward these differences, raising questions about how well electoral politics holds leaders accountable. So, as we reflect on these chapters, we can think about the stakes of presidential elections on the present day, or any election at any level. So that was the first 3 chapters of Unequal Democracy by Larry Bartels. So, looking at electoral politics, again, from a slightly different perspective than we have looked at. So when we looked last week at how voters maybe look at the economy and look back and think about, okay, was the economy good? Was my situation good over the past 4 years? Bartels is saying, okay, maybe voters just are thinking about, okay, was it actually good the past year? Not a full holistic approach of years and years of economic growth. So even if we don't agree with Bartel, or if you disagree with Bartel's analysis, it is still helpful and useful to understand what arguments he's making, because again, it's just another way of looking at electoral politics and how voters behave. Okay, so if you made it to the end, thank you. I appreciate it.